this afternoon, and welcome to what I hope is going to be a really interesting 90 minutes on modern methods of construction and enhancing the housing supply. Thank you for registering. I'd like to make a special welcome, I guess, to some of our students who are joining us from Glasgow and Sheffield universities, and as well as everyone else who's joined us perhaps through the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence's various networks and on Twitter and other places. Modern methods of construction, or MMC, as it's also known, it represents an exciting point of recalibration in housing delivery. I guess a bit like electric cars in automobile industry, but gives us a focus perhaps for the rapid change that's probably going to happen over the next decade or so as we transition toward a zero carbon future. So in our talks and in our discussions, we're going to learn more about this topic and also think a little bit about why the UK lags behind other countries in this area. And we'll talk about why this might be, what can be done about it. But first, let me introduce our speakers. So first of all, we're very pleased to welcome Sonia Oliveira, who's Associate Professor of Architecture and Design Innovation at the University of West of England down in Bristol. Sonia's worked both in architecture practice and research, holding a number of design and innovation focused research grants. She's also published widely on energy efficiency and architecture, so we're very much looking forward to her talk. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Sarah Payne, who's lecturer in real estate at the University of Sheffield in the Department of Planning and Urban Studies. Sarah's worked in both the housing industry and the property sector, as well as in academia as a research scholar. And her research focuses predominantly on the behavior and business models of the volume house building industry. She's a co-investigator, like I am, in the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, where she's currently delivering a project on MMC with our third guest, Bilge Seren, who's a research associate at the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. Bilge comes with a diverse background that encompasses urban design, architecture, and urban politics, and she's worked on these issues in Istanbul and Edinburgh and here in Glasgow. And her current research is focused on a range of these topics around energy efficiency of housing and housing retrofit, MMC, and also high-rise development too. So we're first going to hear from Sonia, who's going to give us a 25-minute talk, which is titled Developing Design Capacity and Compatibility for Net Zero and MMC Housing. After that, Sarah's going to present for 15 minutes on her and Bilge's project, on potential issues in MMC and in particular around housing supply. Then we'll have a Q&A, which Bilge will host, and then we'll obviously during that time take your questions. And Bilge's asked me just to mention that if you've got questions, the best place to put them both during Sonia's talk and Sarah's and towards the end is in the comment chat box, and that allows us to have a list of them there and gives her a list that she can then field to the different speakers. So thank you very much. I'm now going to pass over to Sonia. I'm going to run the slides on my screen, and Sonia's going to talk. We had a few technical problems, which we think we've solved. And so let me just share my screen, make sure that's working, and then I'll hand over to you, Sonia. So there's my screen.
Thank you a lot, James. I think hopefully this won't be a problem, actually. There's been a lot of technological problems the entirety of today, so hopefully this will go well. I actually can't see, I can see your screen now. Okay, so thank you all for joining. I think what I was really keen to talk about today is how we as an industry, architects, engineers and others, develop design capacity and capability for delivering net zero MMC housing. In particular, that's kind of what my talk today will focus on. And it will really look at several areas, drawing on 3 case studies, all were kind of done in the last couple of years, looking in particular how architects are approaching development of design capacity and capability for delivery of MMC. Next.
Oh. Okay.
There are 3 parts to the presentation, starting off with a reflection of our historical positioning within MMC housing. And we have been here before, MMC is not new. However, developing that design capacity and capability requires a different research and practice agenda than currently developed. And concluding with recommendations for next steps. Next. We do have historical examples where there has been a rapid deployment and focus on developing design capacity and capability in the standardization of design components, for instance, and mass production in housing in the 1920s. Frank Lloyd Wright was keen to enable a vision of an architecture that embodied a moral responsibility towards the natural world through new ways of living, with an entirely new approach to the aesthetics and arrangements of daily life, providing a kind of a new citizenry and stewardship of the environment and habitats around us. Next. In the UK, rapid deployment of capacity and capability in the standardization and mass housing delivery was characterized by post-war concerns, addressing really mainly basic housing needs with perhaps less thought and attention devoted to longer-term impact and legacy, including the social, spatial, and environmental or aesthetic visionary strategies in mind. Next. However, since the post-war era, much has changed in both the housing needs, environmental and social profiles of urban as well as rural communities and contexts across the country. There is now a need for greater, not only design and plan with social environmental impact in mind, but also a need to evidence, characterize and test this across different communities. The following insights, which I will elaborate on, will offer some points of departure for further consideration and perhaps also discussion today. Next. So discussion today will draw on these three studies undertaken since about 2017 across different empirical settings, from a focus on architects' views into MMC delivery challenges to residents' experiences of comfort in an MMC smart home development to emerging insights into automation of design capability and capacity for MMC and passive house, named for today's purposes as studies 1 to 3. So starting off with study one involved an in-depth semi-structured interview and documentary analysis with 4 architecture practices, expert in MMC housing delivery in the UK. The focus of the study was really to understand their experiences, approaches to design delivery, key capability and capacity challenges, and views on the future planning of MMC, digital design practice, and community engagement. Next. The data suggests participants shared common views on MMC housing design capability and capacity requirements. The key findings really coalesced around developing a shared inherent knowledge and understanding of manufacturing processes, a greater sharing and cross-pollination of knowledge and skill needed in both practice and education, efficiency on component design, but also a greater consideration of spaces between houses was identified as a way to start to better understand and evidence MMC environmental and social value. 3 areas are highlighted as needing rapid capacity and capability development, both in practice and education. One is developing better understanding and practice into the interrelated connectivities for the smart MMC home, whereby smart sustainable behavior technologies are designed into and manufactured within housing components in an efficient and evidenced manner. Number 2, evidencing MMC environmental and social value. We really don't have well-developed and robust methods to understand and examine the impact of MMC housing delivery or design in terms of health, well-being, comfort, community values, environmental performance, etc. We're yet to develop robust criteria, and there's a critical need for published pre- and post-occupancy large-scale studies. Now, I know Homes England has commissioned a number of these in the last sort of 2 years, but they haven't all been widely available, and certainly there's a lot to be done on POE as well as pre-occupancy in general, but in MMC specifically. And number 3, with the rapid deployment of manufacturing capability, there is a need for regional centres of excellence that can pool expertise and share knowledge to avoid duplication, inefficiency, and to facilitate innovation. This kind of materializes differently across the country. Here in the Southwest, I'm closely involved in discussion with WECA and others to try and develop a regional centre of excellence. Even within the Southwest, it's quite a small portion, I suppose, of the UK in its entirety. That becomes quite difficult. There's a real fragmentation of who does what and how that's delivered, and largely a complete lack of coordination. So factories are emerging in Devon, in Cornwall and elsewhere, often with little knowledge in Bristol. And I'm sure that's replicated across the country. And that's something that I think is a real kind of missed opportunity to coordinate and share knowledge and practice. Next. Study 2, building upon study 1, study 2 examined the complex relationship between social learning of smart technologies in MMC housing development, drawing on visual ethnography, with a focus on the spaces between homes, the community spaces. The study focused on ways residents adapted and managed comfort in their MMC home using smart technologies. Next. So the data from this study suggested use of smart technologies and learning what a home needs was primarily, though not exclusively, about people and community spaces and places, such as the balcony, the allotments, and the greenhouses. In these spaces between, residents found ways to learn, exchange, and share the challenges of their MMC smart home operation. So what this study highlighted that I thought would be useful to bring about today is that a lot of focus, certainly in MMC, has been on the assembly, manufacture, the delivery, the business model of how we put this together at scale. There's been a lot less discussion and, I suppose, attention placed on the spaces between the homes. And what we found in this study that involved a lot of smart technology to operate comfort within the home was that social learning tended to happen in those spaces between, and that the design of those spaces, the balconies, the allotments, the playgrounds, actually brought about, or either exclusively or inclusively, that type of social learning. And there's a lot more needed to understand how we design these spaces between the homes, both in general and in MMC specifically. Next. So in both studies, there's much emphasis placed in the data on the spaces between homes as collective places for social learning. MMC housing design, ability to control the manufacturing process, provides a significant window of opportunity for smart home infrastructure, a way to help address the growing issue of space heating, for instance, in domestic environments, as one of the greatest carbon emitters in the UK. MMC provides that opportunity, but as yet has not been fully explored. Next. Study 3 is underway. I hope to be able to report much more on this, but due to COVID, there's been lots of delays in this study kind of going ahead. We're now in the process of data collection. It enables new insights into capability, automation opportunities in design and delivery of MMC homes, looking at environmental and social analysis in particular. So this study currently involves a large sample of mainly architects, so some engineers as well, where we're looking at opportunities for automation in design, in particular in analysis of daylighting and overheating in both MMC homes and passive house design. And I'm hoping that through that study, we're able to identify other ways that architects and designers in general respond to and react to automation processes in design, but also opportunities for greater efficiency in the delivery of MMC housing. Next. So overall, some key recommendations can be grouped in 3 areas: a need to facilitate a shared resource bank of published large-scale pre- and post-occupancy studies, ways to innovate and provide robust methods to assess environmental and social value, and develop much more connected strategic thinking into both energy and housing policy, for instance. And the last slide really that's on next includes some references of recently published work that talks about the importance of spaces between homes that we often think of from purely ecological, landscape or spatial value, but actually they provide huge social learning opportunities, especially for homes that are managed in so-called smart ways. And also kind of more recently looking at ways that we can better understand both pre-occupancy and post-occupancy evaluation, and how we develop robust methods to conduct that using different tools and technologies. Thank you. I think that was quite a quick turnaround, and I hope that it wasn't too cumbersome. Thanks, James, for going through the slides. I think I'll be happy to take questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sonia. That was great. So yes, let's save questions to the end. I was scribbling down questions when I wasn't supposed to be changing the slides, so if I missed a few, I'm sorry. Now we're going to move on then and hear from Sarah about the project that Sarah and Bilge have been working on, which it'll be interesting to see what the parallels between some of that context and what they've been looking at come together. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, James. Hopefully, does that look okay, James?
Yep.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so thanks for coming along today to the seminar. I'm Sarah Payne, and I'm presenting some work that I've done with myself, with my colleague Bilge, who's on the call today, and also Gareth Young, both based at the Housing Evidence Centre. And I'm going to talk about a project that we've been working on around the potential role for modular construction in addressing systemic supply issues. So really the motivation for this project came about because when looking at the existing evidence, and I'm referring mainly here to the academic evidence, on modern methods of construction, however you wish to define a modern methods of construction, the academic evidence was largely technical, materials-based, focusing on the science of construction technologies and processes and management. And really what I kind of observed was that there was very little evidence examining how modern methods of construction actually fit or potentially fit into existing residential development processes, with a specific interest in considering how MMC might address the systemic supply issues that we face in the UK at the moment. So what I kind of set out to really do was to reframe this investigation to consider modern methods of development. So looking at the ways in which this construction process, this very innovative construction process would fit and fall into existing development practices. And in doing so, it really raised a slightly different set of questions that we saw examined in the existing evidence. So questions around the importance of thinking about the housing system, the system in which development takes place, and stakeholder behaviour. So who are all the different organisations and elements that developers orchestrate and involve in residential development? Again, thinking about the role of the state and the role of policy, and to what extent the state takes a leadership role in helping the market move towards a more modern and disruptive and innovative form of construction. Thinking about land use planning, policy issues, and of course consumer demand and preferences, and the first talk kind of picked up on some of these. And so really the question then becomes about whether house builders, in respect of this issue of systemic undersupply in our housing system in the UK, whether they have the capacity to incorporate these radically new construction methods into their existing development practices, or what else is required of this. So broadening out construction to thinking more of development. So the aim and the objectives that fell out of this interest were to essentially evaluate the potential role of modular construction in addressing systemic supply issues. And that aim was operationalized through 3 core objectives. So looking specifically at the business models, the regulatory practices and consumer preferences in driving the adoption of modular construction. Looking at what evidence exists to explain the low uptake of modular construction in residential development practice. And then thinking through what that means for policy and market processes. So what changes in policy or market processes might enhance the adoption of modular construction within the UK housing system. So in terms of our research approach, we took kind of a 3-staged approach. The first was to engage with key stakeholders and to really, figure out from a policy and practice point of view what they were interested in and what they wanted to see from an evidence review through the Housing Evidence Centre. So we wanted to bake in the relevance of our evidence review to policy and practice, because essentially that was one of the points of the project, was to think through how we can inform policy and market processes. So we did that, and then we undertook, and we've just finished, Bilger and I have just finished an international evidence review looking at academic papers on relevant topics related to the aim, and then obviously the subset of the objectives. So we looked at title and abstracts to remove any unrelated sources, and we did a full text review of a number of articles. I think there was about 47 articles in total. We excluded unrelated articles because the title and the abstract don't always necessarily give you a good understanding of the actual content of the paper, and we excluded a small number of papers for quality assurance issues around the kind of what we would consider to be poorer quality research. So that ended up with us having 22 academic research papers to review, and then again picking up on the comments on the kind of historical development of MMC in the first talk. We actually also had a number of papers that charted the historical development of modern methods of construction, and we'll come back to that in a few slides time when we talk about the importance of that in consumer attitudes and preferences, and we'll have a section on historical development in our report. And then the final stage, we've not yet got to this stage, but again, a very important part of the project is to take the findings of the research and to critically discuss them, to chew over them in a reflection event with key stakeholders involved in policy and practice, with a view to really thinking through how the research can help inform, and drive forward change in modern methods of construction. So we'll be doing that shortly. Now, in terms of the findings, I'm going to talk to the 3 core elements we looked at. So regulatory practices, consumer behaviour and business models. So just starting with regulatory practices, there are a few kind of core findings that dropped out of this. So really that actually regulatory practices can act as facilitators for a higher uptake in some cases. And we found evidence of this in Japan and Singapore and Hong Kong. But also we found evidence that, an insufficiency of proactive government incentives and promotion strategies in driving development. The term used there in that particular article was industrialized building, and we'll come back to definitions in the final slide. So the idea that the government should act as a mentor, as a supervisor or a facilitator, and develop a reasonable set of policies and strategies to help drive MMC into a healthy state. And then specifically around the lack of official legal systems or strong government support, inhibiting the development of MMC construction methods, developers and contractors being a bit hesitant to take the lead in furthering progress. And actually in the UK we see what people may refer to as market disruptors like LNG Homes and Urban Splash really driving forward modular homes. And then, of course, we can't look at anything to do with housing development without looking at the issues around a myriad of regulatory controls and the planning system slowing down the process. And we found evidence of that in the review as well, conflicting regulations, stifling innovation, and building regulations and slow processes of obtaining planning permission, inhibiting the use of off-site modern methods of construction. And then interestingly, in an article by Lovell and Smith back in 2010, their research looked at this kind of distinct culture of UK housing construction, which really acted as a field of force, which inhibited other forms of what they called, I guess, assemblages, and in respect of MMC, prefabrication assemblages, coming through, and really this causing what they refer to as masonry lock-ins. So thinking through that system of housing construction, the way in which planners and insurers and contractors and surveyors and mortgage lenders all behave, acting as a way in which that creates a lock-in in the masonry brick and block construction process, and preventing the prefabrication process from coming forward. So that's in terms of regulatory practices. Now, in terms of business models, again, a few key points emerged that were quite interesting. So this idea of there being a business culture inertia, this idea of a protectionism or conservatism inherent within the industry, and construction and design being about evolution rather than revolution, and there being no core preemptory norms, and also from that, whether in fact that there being little clarity as to how this form of construction can be integrated into business processes and organizational level. And then looking at the bias towards tradition as well. So the perception that modern methods is architecture off the shelf, or the fact that it might diminish individuality and uniqueness and creativity. And again, a couple of perceptions around the cost benefits, the fact that it might not be economically viable for the wider industry, and so forth. And then interestingly, a few, and this again links to the first presentation, a couple of a handful of interesting articles really referred to kind of the softer issues around modern methods of construction, and the fact that perhaps it had focused too much on the technical features, but actually had not paid enough attention to the culture and the people and what they wanted from a home, and what modular housing or modern methods of construction represented to them and their needs. So, more attention needing to be paid to dealing with stakeholders, particularly the market and the user market in that respect, but also other stakeholders not involved in project delivery. So again, hinting to the wider system here, the financial institutions and the banks as well. And then just a couple of observations around how cooperation in the industry is kind of weak in many cases in terms of implementing these construction processes through the whole supply chain. So again, looking at the emphasis on designers and manufacturers and suppliers in being an integrated aspect of a successful business model, them recognizing and engaging in this process. So again, talking back to this idea of looking at MMC from a wider system perspective. And then finally, MMC is an incredibly capital intensive process, and it requires a consistent and predictable market, and requires capital to set up and provide continuity for this kind of paradigm of building, which does go against some of the more traditional development and construction processes. And then finally, moving on to consumer preferences, and again, this is where the historical part of the project comes into force. So we know, and we've read about the fact that there is a historical and a social and institutional issues around prefabrication that we can see from experiences and experiments in the 60s and 70s that have locked into our memory of what modern methods or modular or prefabrication is. That the concerns there exist, but then obviously the research goes against that and says that the systematic failure of that process of construction is actually unfounded. So there's a challenge there to be met in terms of marketing, and actually we found that in some of the research, and particularly in Japan, the industry has sought themselves to challenge that stigma by selling and advertising MMC products as quality products. And also we found evidence that there was a real lack of government promotion of modern methods of construction, which caused some consumer misconceptions and perceptions around industrialized building, as we refer to it in that literature. And then a couple of interesting elements around the balance between standardization and customization with modular homes. So there was a couple of papers that explored this dynamic and looked at whether standardization was actually unrealistic if we are emerging into a market that's striving for individuality. So again, thinking about the softer and emotional and individual issues that come with consumers purchasing modern methods of construction homes or modular homes, you know, whether they feel, because it's modular, they actually want to feel like they have influenced the home, and whether it caters for their preferences and individuality. And that does come up against this drive towards standardization that we see modular homes and modern methods of construction going into as a space. However, we can then look at it in another way, and the Japanese literature shows us that actually, if you're looking at mass producing houses with components as opposed to entire house models, actually the combination of those components can enable some buyers to customize their new homes and for the market to respond to individual housing demand needs. So just very briefly to reflect and talk about our next steps, the key reflections for myself and Bilge really were, and I think this has come through very clearly in the presentation so far, is the limited definitional and conceptual development of modern methods of construction and modular homes in particular. I used a range of definitions there: industrialized building. And we find that in the literature, and actually practice is way ahead of academia in this sense. I mean, I know there's been working groups and they put out reports around, you know, trying to define modern methods of construction in order to make sure there's clarity amongst all of the stakeholders involved in the built environment. And we also reflected on the fact that there probably is a need for path-breaking interventions to facilitate the widespread adoption of modern methods of construction as well. And also, of course, with our evidence review, we only found 22 articles that really specifically, referenced, there's some interference there, going back to it, that reference the systemic challenges and the barriers behind low uptake, not from just a technical point of view, but thinking about the development process in general. And then, of course, linking nicely to the previous presentation, and whether offsite methods can actually be used to help address the climate emergency and carbon reduction, and whether that becomes a main driver. And you'll see some of the narrative coming through with government announcements on modern methods of construction, that whilst in the last few years, the focus had been on productivity, economies of scale, actually we're beginning to see now the attention shift towards MMC as a way of addressing climate emergency and carbon reduction, as well as supply as well. So yeah, that's it for the presentation. In terms of next steps, we're going to hold a critical discussion and reflection event with industry and policy. So if you're here today and are interested in attending that, my email's there, so please do contact me, and we'll be disseminating the report via the usual channels. And I'll pass back over to James. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That was really interesting. There's so many issues here too, that as someone who's interested in housing design, sort of trying to connect design and sustainability, modern methods of construction all together, and whether they can be brought together to achieve all the different types of outcomes we're looking for in the industry. What I'm going to do now, I've already seen lots of questions appearing in the chat, and I've got a few I'm going to add myself in a second. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Bilge Seren, who's going to lead the question and answer session that we've got. I can't remember exactly what time we're going to. Is it 3:30, Chris? Is that right?
Yeah, 3:30, James.
Great. Okay. All right. Over to you then, Bilge.
Okay, thanks, James. And thank you, Sarah and Sonia. It was really good to see both presentations together, for me at least, different perspectives and studies all together about this up-and-coming topic, actually, regarding the change in the industry in the recent years. So I will try to ask the questions to you, just framing them a little bit to the general topics, and I will direct all questions to both of you, if that's okay, both Sarah and Sonia. So you can comment on those, although some of them are directed to particular presenters. So the first question is about standardization and customization dilemma and the debates around that. And it's more about how the local distinctiveness can manifest in MMC. So how do we ensure that local distinctiveness is manifest in MMC, and that we are not just swapping an architecture of the fact and production of volume housing for another, the question is. And where is the domain of opportunity for craft, for expression? So I would like to ask you, what do you think about this customization, standardization dilemma and design issues, how they can be integrated in the MMC process?
Do you want me to answer first, or? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I don't think there's one answer. I think it's very context specific, and I think it also depends on the needs of the user. So, you know, I'm currently working on a project that involves MMC housing, and we're doing a social and environmental assessment of housing for vulnerable adults who normally leave care at 18 years of age in the UK and have nowhere to live. And, you know, so I think in that context, the approach was to build as fast as possible and to provide accommodation and safety and security. And actually, some of the planning requirements were overlooked on the basis that it was seen as temporary accommodation. I think it depends on the context, and it depends on the needs of the user. And I think some of the climate change issues should come to the forefront of all of that. And, you know, sometimes that's a kind of specific discussion with the planning authority, with the users on, you know, how something should look and whether it should respond to a particular context to match that context or not. I don't think there's one answer. You know, I think it's dependent on where you are in the world and in the country.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really good question, and one that we do need to grapple with. So I think there's a few ways of looking at it. There's what the kind of the volume industry would do, and then what the SMEs would do. And I think, you know, they're under different pressures, and I think there's different scope for, you know, perhaps maybe the MSEs to look on a site-by-site basis and to bring in some more bespoke design, although, you know, in some respects, volume builders do that with certain sites with design codes. But there's also a policy and a regulatory issue here at hand, because on the one hand, you've had the government for a number of years now, you know, using MMC as a way of enhancing productivity, particularly of speeding up the build of development, and also, you know, driving productivity and economic growth. And how that is going to marry with then looking at enhancements in design, you know, making sure that each development is specific to the needs of the site and addresses climate issues, so deals with issues around water and surface, you know, runoff and those sorts of things, is something that we're going to have to grapple with. So I think on the one hand, there's a risk that standardization does continue and you know, becomes even more prevalent with modular construction. And then the need for perhaps policy to ensure that they are making sure that the focus on MMC does generate greater benefits just beyond the productivity, you know, build, speed up development.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we will discuss more these customization issues in coming years and days regarding MMC and overall housing production in a way. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move to the other question, which is about actually sharing knowledge and being aware of the fact that what is available in the industry, that Sonia talked about a little bit on this. And the question is, might there be a possible digital database for this available tools, available products in the UK construction market, so the developers can actually know what is there or not. So it's kind of asking for elaboration on these topics, if you can reflect on it a little bit more.
Yes, I mean, that's a really good question. I think there's a number of people already working on developing this database, but potentially in parallel rather than together. And you know, there's a movement in the last couple of years for community-led building, co-housing, self-building, and I think a database that enables access to components, to ways of assembling, especially for those potential developers, is really needed, but also for those who have their own factories and who are developing, who can share. We've seen, particularly in COVID, issues with supply chain, and that will continue. So I think a way to share, at least at component level, you know, through a digital platform, what exists, where you can get it, who has what, I think would be a really efficient, effective and sustainable way forward, and that, you know, can work, and not against, but with commercial interests in mind. So definitely, I think there are a few people working on it already, so I think it is underway. But what would be good is that there was one place rather than multiple. Sometimes we tend to duplicate a lot. But yeah, I think it's, you know, that's kind of what I was getting at.
Sarah, do you want to reflect on similar topics? Oh, okay. So I'm going to move to the other question, which is more about the consumer satisfaction, actually, because we know there are lots of criticism about MMC products as well, although we know their advantages. So the question is, various studies of buyers of new housing show dissatisfaction with the product. And this satisfaction could be about space, insulation, or other materials. So does MMC get more positive ratings, do you think, and why do you think it can or cannot?
Yeah, so we didn't find any evidence of studies that were done that really looked in detail at this question. So I think that is it. There's a gap in the evidence, and of course there's a lag in what's published in academic research, you know, as to when the results, the research was undertaken. If we look at what's happening at the moment with the urban splash developments and LNG homes, it'd be really interesting actually if we had some research that was underway and looked at some post-occupancy you know, interviews with the people to see whether actually it addressed this question. So in brief, we don't know, but we do need to know. That's one of the gaps that we've identified.
Sonia, if you'd like to comment on it as well.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have evidence basically that's recent or current, but certainly publicly available. I think POE is carried out, certainly by developers, but it isn't published or publicly available. So that's where we need to move pretty quickly, rapidly. And I've been arguing for that in my evidence contribution to the House of Lords and elsewhere, that we need to mandate POE. And we need to publicly kind of make it available in an anonymized way so that we can actually learn from what we're doing, sometimes at scale. You know, we're developing and building very fast, and not really learning quickly enough. So yeah, I would agree completely with Sarah.
I think there are lots of potentials, but probably we need more assessment on good examples as well to learn more what can work and what can be improved in a better way, in a way. So thank you. There is another question. It is more about the labor and capital issues, which is a key topic actually in MMC debates, because it's quite a capital intensive investment in a way. And the question is there any evidence that cheap construction labor acts as a disincentive to invest in capital intensive processes like MMC? So if it is cheaper to hire more workers, why would developers invest in MMC? Because we know it's quite expensive. So if this is kind of the problem or the thing happening, could Brexit boost MMC in a way? I would like to ask both you reflect on this labor and capital debates a bit for the UK and for other contexts as well.
Yeah, so again, you know, we don't know because we don't have the evidence, and I think that's one of the key reflections of the project we've done, Bilger, isn't it? That there's actually very little evidence, very little up-to-date evidence. The logic would say, you know, as some of the research we found spoke about in terms of new paradigms, you know, MMC is very capital intensive, and really going back to the paper from Lovell and Smith, speaking about this lock-in, the masonry lock-in that we see in the construction industry. And I think this question is a reflection of exactly that. So again, thinking through how do we address that is one of the key areas that we require more evidence in going forward.
So, Sonia, would you like to reflect on it as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, especially in the context of this pandemic, to actually answer in a knowledgeable way, because I think there's a lot that we're still grappling with in terms of construction during a pandemic. And I think there are bigger issues around land ownership and in this country that I think, you know, and land value and how that varies around the country, and development planning. I think these are sort of issues that are, you know, big for both housing in general and MMC, but a lot of local authorities have been looking at plots of land they have that they would classify as small plots, not of any value to mass developers, and looking at MMC as a solution. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of movement, certainly in development of social housing run by local authorities, and I think that will expand, and that, you know, is apparently a more cost-effective way because of the fact that there are small plots of land dispersed all over that don't lend themselves to traditional building. So again, you know, I think it's a difficult question to answer generally because there are many components to it, but to me the bigger issue is land ownership.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting point, land, because in our work with Sarah, we haven't come across almost anything about it, but it is quite definitive in a way, because in our work with James for high-rise development, we have read a lot of things about how land kind of plays a role, because, you know, if you're a large developer, you can acquire large areas and you can develop as much as you can. But if you're a small developer, it's not very easy if it is a capital intensive industry that you're operating in. So I think land is quite a big missing chunk in the evidence in a way for MMC. So I'd like to move to the other question, which is connected with this one. It's about the developers and their scale, if they're a large developer or small and medium enterprises. And the question is asking, if either of you come across use of MMC by small and medium enterprises, like self-built on site where land is developed and subdivided into plots for buyers to seek out their own houses, own builders, for example, for their own houses. So that kind of operation, not by just large developers, but small enterprises. If you have some examples for that, the question asks that.
So for our project, I don't think we came across any studies that had looked specifically at SMEs and modern methods of construction. So I'll hand straight over to Sonia.
I don't think, again, it's evidenced in literature, but I think there is a lot happening on the ground. Certainly in the last year, 2 years, I'm aware of local projects, regional projects where that is happening. But no, I don't think it's yet evidenced, certainly not in the academic literature, maybe in some of the trade and grey literature.
I think one thing about this is MMC is considered usually like kind of a business for large-scale developers. But actually, if people can access to the parts that are produced as prefabs, like, you know, stairs or kitchens or walls, etc., if this can be accessed by small developers as well, then that can be, that can change in a way, but I think we're not there yet. I agree with you on that. So I'm going to move to the other questions because we have some more due to time. One thing is about the social spaces for communities and sharing knowledge, which was covered in Sonia's presentation a bit. And the question is, what do you think that the key teams questions in those areas can be addressed, how people can share knowledge in those spaces for using these new developed ways of living, and how should we use the data to drive change in the industry if we can get that information from the users. So I like to ask this question more like, how do you think we should engage with users in terms of their experiences in MMC built homes, and how we can kind of reframe users as stakeholders in this whole process?
Yeah, I mean, where this whole notion of social learning in outside spaces, this was more focused on use of smart technologies in MMC, so managing comfort was seen as very problematic. There was very little user control, so a lot of these external spaces provided opportunities for social learning. And there's been very little work done on how the design of those external spaces influences those opportunities, whether they're enclosed or open, whether they're fenced off or not, how they're orientated, whether they have sunny spots or not. So I think there's a lot of kind of landscape and spatial design considerations that haven't really been studied in this context that would be, good to know more about. And I know when I kind of discovered it first, the value of balconies and allotments and greenhouses for this type of learning was quite astonishing, just how much it was sought and what it meant. And when I looked for work in this field, there was very little done. So it's something that I think would be good to understand better, and will kind of inform, the development of MMC developments as well, because I think they're often just not well considered, the spaces between in general, but also in terms of social learning. But that's, I think it would be good to do more.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to reflect really on the issue from the perspective of kind of research that I've been doing recently around green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, sustainable urban drainage systems. These are all elements that fit within those spaces between houses. And I think developers I think there's kind of, I wouldn't say a moral shift, but there's been a shift in their thinking around the value of these spaces, even if there isn't a premium that they can gain from the actual value of the property. The footprint, actually, the kind of the social and environmental value of these spaces is becoming more important, and is going to help developers address broader climate-based questions around, water management, water resilience, water efficiency, biodiversity as well, access to green spaces. So I think it's a really important part of research that we need to drive forward and look at it from a variety of different angles, from angles of MMC, angles of design, angles of environmental and capacity and climate emergency. So definitely something that's going to be on my radar in the next few months and years.
Exactly. So we have 2 more questions, but we have a very little time remaining. So I'm going to firstly ask those questions to you, and I will ask your final comments around that questions as well. One question is about intergenerational issues, because younger people are having more problems with the access to affordable housing. And if you have come across any studies focusing on generational aspects of using MMC housing. And the other one is about the bureaucracy, how it hinders kind of a development, and also the suggestion by Sonia to have more regional centers for expertise and how this can come together. So these are the final questions for you to comment on.
Yeah, so in terms of the intergenerational, we didn't come across any specific research that looked at this, although we do, I do acknowledge, Homes England, for example, with their affordable housing fund, they're requiring a certain element to be delivered through modern methods of construction, so that's positive. And then in terms of the regional centres of excellence, again, really interesting question, because obviously there's a role at national government for promoting MMC, but actually what we find is there's a lot of learning that takes place in geographically and spatially defined areas where you might have a local authority that's pioneering the use of MMC, and actually that encourages a regional division of a volume house builder or a regional developer or even a local developer to have the confidence to go forward with that kind of design. So again, that's a positive thing that can come out of, for example, Homes England, funding some sites and going into partnerships at a regional level. And yeah, I'll pass on to Sonia for her final reflection.
Yeah, regarding to generational studies, I haven't looked at that specifically, so I can't comment, whether evidence exists or not. I haven't actually been looking at that at all. But in terms of whether this, formation of regional centres or a shared platform is hindered by bureaucracy, I mean, I think it's mainly hindered by, the market-based economy. So I think, that's just the way things evolve. So I don't think it's hindered necessarily by bureaucracy. And I think it is being developed. I think there just needs to be a greater sharing of knowledge and learning, and an understanding that post-occupancy valuation will lead to potentially, hopefully, better homes. So it's of a commercial interest to those involved. I think there's just a fear that, something negative will come out and it will be in the public domain, and it might hinder the development of MMC. So I think that's just a cultural shift that needs to happen more than anything else. But yeah, I don't think it's a bureaucratic issue. I think it's to do with market-based economies and just the way that we tend to develop in this part of the world. So I think it's more that kind of issue.
Okay, thank you. I think we, just 3:30, so we have to wrap up here. Yep. I will ask if you want to comment on anything else that we haven't covered. Otherwise, I think we will conclude here today. And I will thank you for your participation and for the great questions from our participants as well.
Yeah, we should say also that we're recording this, which I think we're going to make available so that people can come back to it. And I'm sure that there was a couple of questions that came in just there at the end that I'm sure that the panel will be happy to answer if you send them a message. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Assume they are, but they're nodding, so that's good. And thank you very much, Bilge, for moderating the discussion. Thank you both to Sarah and Sonia for excellent presentations. And it's an exciting time, and I think the next few years is going to lead to a lot of change in this area, and a lot of rapid change. I'm interested to see where it goes. So thank you very much, and everyone have a nice weekend. It is nearly with us.